I couldn't get away without showing you this particular picture. Does anybody want to tell me what this is? The Kentucky Derby, Churchill Downs, absolutely. So what you're going to hear from me is remarkably confluent with what you heard earlier from Dr. Hidalgo Simon. The questions are very much the same. I, by the way, have an unusual position in a sense because not only have I had this research interest in PML and treated a large number of people with PML over the years, but I also serve as the director of an MS clinic that's a fairly busy MS clinic at the University of Kentucky. We follow close to 2,000 patients. So what I thought I'd do to try and define where this interface is between academia and clinical medicine is to frame the questions that are posed to me by neurologists. So the first is getting back to this risk-benefit ratio that we talked about yesterday. Should my patient be treated with natalizumab? I cannot tell you the frequency with which I field that question, and how I usually end up fielding the question is the following. I am referred the patient because the physician caring for the patient doesn't want to pull the trigger. They just feel uncomfortable using some of the newer MS agents, and they say, I don't understand the risk-benefit ratios, I don't want to deal with it, and I don't want to deal with the liability, potential liability of giving this drug and having something bad happen. So therefore, I'm going to send them to the university. That's what happens. Or if it's not the university, it may be an MS clinic. It's not unique to Kentucky, and I'll address that a little later on in the talk. So that's question number one. The second is the physicians asking, can I predict who it is that's going to develop PML? They'll ask questions like, are there patients I shouldn't put on the drug? And that is a particularly interesting question. They'll also say, what laboratory parameters should I follow? And I think my slides are a bit out of sequence here, as you'll see a little later. But they will say, should I be performing MRIs every 6 months? Should I be performing MRIs every 12 months? Should I be getting JC virus PCR on their blood? What value is that? Should I be trusting the JC virus antibody results that you provided to me from the Stratify study, which is hopefully soon to be a commercialized test? Those are the types of questions that we get. What are the predictors in my patient? And the other very common question is, what is the value of a drug holiday? Not infrequently, I will be sitting down with neurologists and they'll say, well, you know, I know that PML is a risk after 18 months or 24 months. I simply stop the drug at that point in time. And then I say, well, explain to me how that helps. They don't understand the biology behind it. PML diagnosis. So this is another thing that I hear with some regularity. I hear my patient has a new neurologic problem. I don't know whether this is MS or PML. I'm sending him over to your clinic for you to figure out for me. So the issue of making the diagnosis is one that is of critical importance. And then on rare occasion, the people that call and say, my patient has PML, how should I treat them? And I not infrequently get these calls because they've first gone to the NIH, and Gene says, well, I'm really not a treating physician. Why don't you call Joe Berger? So they get filtered. But this is another very important question, which is the treatment of PML. And therefore, I say, these are the common questions that we hear in academia, and they converge very well with what you heard earlier from regulatory. So the research questions from the clinical arena have to do with the following: risk mitigation, namely patient selection and identifying predictors for PML, diagnosing PML, finding the earliest identifiable features, and developing algorithms for the diagnosis, and lastly, the treatment of PML. Now, I just want to mention this because I find it rather fascinating, and I can't address what happens in European countries because I haven't practiced in any of them, but I can tell you that things are changing very rapidly in the United States. I will often walk into a room full of neurologists and say, how many of you diagnose brain tumors? Every single hand in the audience goes up. Then I say, well, how many of you treat brain tumors? Not one hand, not one. Why? Why is it that the neurologists feel comfortable diagnosing brain tumors, yet they're not treating brain tumors? And the answer is they don't have the comfort level. They are scared of the drugs that are used. They're relatively unfamiliar with the latest treatment strategies. And trust me, for brain tumors, they're not terribly complex. But they don't treat it. If you walk into a room full of neurologists and you say, how many of you diagnose MS? Every hand goes up. You say, how many of you treat MS? Every hand goes up. But let me tell you something, that is changing. And it started changing in 2005, where neurologists increasingly feel uncomfortable treating multiple sclerosis. And it's not that infrequent that they will say, I've made the diagnosis, I'm going to turn that patient over to an MS center or an MS expert. And increasingly we're seeing that, and my belief is, and I haven't had too many people challenge me on this, that over the course of the next decade, in large measure, not entirely, the treatment of multiple sclerosis will be by MS experts. They needn't be at a university. They could be MS centers, freestanding MS centers, or individuals that have some expertise in MS that happen to be in practice. By the way, private practice neurology in the United States is going to be a thing of the past as well. But increasingly, it is going to be the MS authority. And that is going to have advantages because we will have a better idea of what the case numbers are, of what identification of this disease will be better. The treatment of it, I suspect, the early identification of it will be better. So there'll be certain advantages to having authorities deal with this group of individuals. Now, I couldn't leave without quoting my favorite English personage. I will remind you that Winston Churchill's mother was an American. And he said there's nothing wrong with change if it's in the right direction. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure there'll be questions.